Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Lena and I make college and book related content here on YouTube. And today I'll be sharing with you all my July wrap up. This video is a little bit delayed. I haven't really filmed a YouTube video since the beginning of July, so it's been a little over a month. I haven't posted in 2 weeks. I definitely took a break, and that was a much needed break because my past semester that I just finished really burnt me out, and I really needed some time to take a deep breath and just relax, but I also had a lot of things that I had to get done. I started work immediately and just lots been going on, but here I am ready to talk about the books that I read in the month of July. So in the month of July, I read 5 books. The first week was my finals week, and then right after that, I find I struggle to continue reading right after I get out of finals, so it took me a while to get back on the reading track, but I did end up reading 5 books. The first book I read in the month of July was The Empress of Salt and Fortune by Wevo. I'm not really sure how to say her name, but basically that book is a fantasy novella. It takes place in a country that is very similar to Imperial China. There is the North and the South, and this young royal woman is sent to marry essentially the emperor. It's an arranged marriage, and that marriage quickly falls apart and she is banished. At the same time, Rabbit, who is a young handmaiden, is sent with her and is banished alongside her. And this book basically follows the story of those 2 characters as well as some other characters and kind of watches what happens and explores some really important and impactful themes. I gave this book 4 out of 5 stars. It was probably one of the better books I read this month for sure. It is actually a novella, and I realized when I was reading this that I kind of had a prejudice against shorter books, and I felt like they weren't as good, or like they're not as important, or I shouldn't devote my time to reading them. But I actually really enjoyed reading this book, and this was the second novella that I read right in a row because at the end of June I read The Deep. And I really enjoyed both of those books, so I'm definitely going to look more towards novellas in the future. I really liked the way this story unfolded. I think the author was really talented in slowly revealing piece by piece, letting the reader figure some stuff out, but also making sure it was pretty clear and not insanely vague. As I said, it had some really wonderful and powerful themes such as gender and the exploration of what gender means, gender roles, the power dynamics within that, as well as an indictment of the monarchy and kind of what's wrong with absolute power and the issues and greed and horrible things that come from this power, and also maybe a different way forward. I also thought it was really interesting the perspective of history and keeping history and retelling history and why history needs to stay alive to some capacity. I do wish it was longer, I'm not gonna lie. I think it would have been a stellar full novel and so much more could be done with it. I know this is the first in a series. I think there's a second book. I obviously have not read it, but I am interested in picking it up, and I think it's definitely worth a read. The second book I read in the month of July was Fathers and Sons by Ivan Turgenev. This is my Russian lit for my past semester. I tried to read a piece of Russian literature in every single academic semester, so this semester it was Fathers and Sons. I chose this book for a couple different reasons, but mostly because of its historical context. Also, it is a famous piece of literature. And it basically takes place in 1861 in Russia. And Russia's really at a turning point between these different sets of beliefs, between what should be done with the serfs, what should be done with their power and their princes and their czar, and all of those really complicated things that Russia's trying to grapple with as the younger generation comes up with all these newer ideas that really challenges the way the older generation was living. One of the main characters, Bazarov, who is best friends with Arkady, really converts him into this whole school of nihilism, and this is kind of the first time that nihilism was named in a piece of literature and was so explicit, and which was also really interesting to read about as well. I gave this book 3 out of 5 stars, maybe 3.5. I really enjoyed the way the relationship between the older generation and the younger generation was portrayed. I thought that was really well done. Of course, when younger generations go off to college or explore the world, they start to form their own ideas and push back against what they learned and what they grew up with, and I think that is so relevant with every different different generation and how they interact with each other. I also think it's interesting the way that the older generation reacts to this. The older generation in this book kind of stepped back and just let them go forward with it, and then other parts of the older generation were like, no, you can't do this. So I just thought that was really interesting to read about. Of course, it's a piece of Russian literature, so there were some really, really stellar lines that I would just love to read and reread over and over again. I just really enjoy reading Russian literature because of the ambiance and just like there's just this feeling when you read those books, and it's just something I love so much. That being said, I had some issues with the book. I did choose a Constance Garnett translation because I've read all of her translations and I really like her work, but I didn't like this translation. I found it a little questionable at times and I didn't really know why. This book was published in the 80s, so I don't know if there have been updates to the translation since then. But I also really did not like the way that women were portrayed in this book and women were talked about in this book and they were treated in this book. I mean, I know it was a different time when this book was written and also when it was set, but it just seemed like the normal misogyny was amplified and it was worse than I was used to for this kind of time and place and genre. And I really was uncomfortable with that for much of the book. And it was kind of icky feeling to me, so I did not really like that at all, but I do think it was worth a read for me personally as someone who really likes Russian literature, wants to learn more about their history and culture and kind of where their literature has come from. And the third book that I read in the month of July was The Lowland by Jhumpa Lahiri. This book is a family saga, that's how it's described. It takes place in India in the 1940s all the way up to present day essentially. It goes from India to America, all over the United States and all over India as well, and it really explores a lot of what was going on historically, politically, and all of those other issues. India itself is going through an enormous revolution as different parties are grappling for power, and communism is kind of coming in and out and changing shape based on the party, as well as America is obviously dealing with this as well, and then there's anti-war and anti-Vietnam protests, and so it's a really interesting perspective on that. It covers two brothers, Yudhayan and Subhash, who are at the beginning of the story as young teen boys. They are a year apart, they're really close, they're brothers, and they have grown up together, but when tragedy strikes, it really changes the way that one of the brothers lives his life. And then we also get to hear from another perspective of one of the brothers' wives, Gauri, and she is also grappling with this tragedy and the changes in the country and the changes globally, nationally, etc. I really enjoyed the historical aspect of this book. That is kind of why I picked it up, because I didn't learn a lot about India's history growing up. In middle school or high school, I wanted to learn more about this time in history, so I was really interested in that. But also I'm someone who loves to read books about families and kind of how families get through things together and the power of family and love. This was not one of those books, and that's kind of why I struggled with it. This is definitely a book with an estranged family, and it honestly becomes more and more estranged as it continues. I hope that's not really a spoiler, but it was really difficult for me to read, and actually in reading this book I realized that that's one of the things in books that I struggle to get through and actually not give up on a book. I really enjoyed some aspects of this book. I thought the writing was beautiful, it was unique, it was different from what I had been reading in previous books. I also like the cover as well. I just like the whole watercolor thing. I think the symbolism of the lowland and how it connects to the characters and their lives and what they're facing is also really powerful. It offered a really interesting exploration of culture, both India and America, specifically New England, when Subhash moves to New England, and I think it's Rhode Island, and kind of how he views that through the lens of someone who lived in India all his life. And then I think that's really interesting as someone who lives in New England, seeing it through a different perspective. That being said, I hated the ending of this book. I despised the ending. I think it weakened the whole story. It really was upsetting for me. I just didn't like it. I also just really struggled with some aspects of the story as well. I didn't think it was as well done as it could have been, because some parts of the novel were a little repetitive and they kind of just like drove on this point, and I was like, we already know this, we can move on. But I did appreciate this book and I did learn a lot, and I'm glad I have my own copy. I realized I just made an error. I read The Bird King before I read The Lowland, but I'm too lazy to go back and refilm it, so This was the third book I read, and I read the Lowland fourth. The third book I read in the month of July was The Bird King by G. Willow Wilson. This is a fantasy novel set in the Iberian Peninsula, and it is during the late 15th century, so kind of when the Spanish Inquisition is really taking control and driving Christianity as the forefront. I found the premise of this story to be really fascinating. Fatima is the Circassian concubine to the last sultan, and she has been a concubine her whole life. She was born into it. But when the Spanish monarchy arrives, they suspect trouble, and Fatima quickly has to flee with her best friend Hassan, who is a map maker, because he will be killed for threatening Christian values and what the Spanish monarchy is trying to get rid of, and through the Spanish Inquisition. Fatima and Hassan are able to escape with the help of a jinn, and they embark on their insane journey to really find the Bird King, which is kind of this old folklore myth that they heard growing up. I gave this book 3 out of 5 stars, honestly considering giving it 2 out of 5. The writing style did take me some time to get used to because it's kind of witty and sarcastic, and that's not something I really gravitate towards with fantasy novels. And I honestly, as a result, kind of found the book baffling because the premise fascinated me. I really am into fantasy books that are based in historical reality, but that they can kind of take that and run with it and shape it in the way that they want to. I found Fatima as a character incredibly hard to read. Not only was she not likable in the slightest from my perspective, but she was extremely inconsistent as a character. I didn't really see development or growth, even though I was supposed to see it. It was clear I was supposed to see it, but I just didn't. She really drove me up the wall. I thought that the portrayal of Hassan, the map maker, was incredibly questionable. He is a gay man in this book, and he is one of Fatima's greatest and longest friends, but I just really didn't like reading about him from her perspective because she kind of was taking advantage of him and kind of really using him in really wrong ways, and I just did not like that, and I thought that his character was mishandled extremely poorly. But all in all, I do think this book offered an interesting perspective. I think that's why I gave it 3 out of 5 stars, because it offered this perspective between Christianity versus Islam and kind of how those two religions are really easy to pit against each other, and how through the Spanish Inquisition so much hate was spread and so much evil through this need for power and not really religion and what religion stands for, and the dangers of organized religion. But I think that this book really did try to teach a lesson of tolerance and how we can all live. Of course, I would love a lesson of acceptance, but I do think this book tried to go along with that theme and really explore the ways that these two religions intersect, as well as just different people and how a religion doesn't make a person one thing or another. The last book I read in the month of July was Indiana by George Sand. This was my French read. I started it in the beginning of June, and I basically finished at the end of July, taking some breaks in between. I read this book completely in French, which was a little intimidating at first, but I did make it through. It basically follows the story of Indiana, the main character, who is a young woman married to Colonel Delmore, and she has been married to him for quite some time. They live in France, but she's actually originally from the Isle of Reunion, and so she is struggling with her new life. She falls in love with Raymond, who she thinks is so dashing and so handsome and so wonderful, and things just really spiral out of control. Her cousin Ralph is trying to protect her, and she just really can't get anything that she wants or even live a happy life because she is a woman, and that's kind of why George Sand wrote this story. I thought the introduction was really fascinating, and that made me want to read the book. And there were some really great lines and ideas about feminism and women's rights and kind of what women were up against during this time period, especially when you consider when this book was published and what other types of books are being published during this time and what they were saying about women. I think George Sand lived a really, really fascinating life. I would love to learn more about her life, her lifestyle, and I do want to read other of her books because I think she was very important in the literary world, especially the French literary world. And as a French major and English lit major, I'm obviously very interested in that. I do think this book was allegedly about, it was anti-slavery and anti-colonialism. I really didn't see that. I didn't read it that way. Maybe it was at the time, kind of like how Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, and that was read as anti-slavery, but it really didn't come off that way in a 21st century perspective. And obviously I'm reading in French, so I might have been missing some clues, but I didn't really read it that way, and I did find some ways that it was discussed a little questionable. And my other issue with this book was Ralph as her cousin. I think he may be one of the most evil people I've ever read about. He was truly deplorable, and the ending still makes me angry. Like, I don't understand it. I thought George Sand and I were on the same page. I was like, yes, I'm with Indiana. I don't love Indiana, but I get where she's coming from and why she's doing what she's doing. And then the ending happened, and I was just like, what was that? Like, I don't know what just happened. I don't know what happened in the previous 400 pages that led up to this moment, but that was that. So, still concerned about the ending, questioning the ending. Was George Sand, what was she saying? Because I don't get it. But that was Indiana, and I am glad I read it, and I'm hoping to read other pieces of George Sand's work. And those are all the books I read in the month of July. Currently, I'm reading A Ceiling Made of Eggshells by Gail Carson Levine. I picked this up because I grew up on Gail Carson Levine. I loved her work growing up, and I kind of just wanted to lighten it up a little bit and read a children's book. This is also about the Spanish Inquisition, which is really interesting because it's from a Jewish perspective in contrast to the Bird King, so I think another wonderful perspective to read from. That is all for today's video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope I will be able to post next week and see you all then, but until then, have a wonderful week.